Aloha, welcome back to the afternoon sessions. I know everybody is just getting back to logging in, so I'm going to wait just a second. We got 50, 54. We're moving up right now. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome back. My name is John Hart. I'm the moderator for this session. It's titled DOTA Post-Construction Best Management Practice Manual Updates and Implementation. Please use the Q&A selection during the presentation to ask any questions you may have. At the end of the presentation, we may have a few minutes for the speaker to answer your questions. Please use the Q&A, and if we are short on time, we will get back to you either individually or reach out somehow. So please allow me to introduce our speaker for this session. Vijaya Tummala is a senior project manager in Environmental Services and Training Center. She has over 17 years of experience in civil, environmental, and water resources engineering fields. She's a subject matter expert in post-construction Pbmp design, inspection, and maintenance, including low-impact development measures. She has managed numerous MS4 planning, design, construction, and compliance projects and programs for the state of Hawaii, Department of Transportation's Airport Division. Ms. Tummala is a licensed professional civil engineer, certified professional in erosion and sediment control, and a certified inspector of sediment in erosion control. So please help me welcome Ms. Vijaya Tummala. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone. Thank you for attending the 2021 Protect Our Water Conference this year again. And as John mentioned, my presentation is about DOT, Airport Division, Post-Construction Best Management Practice Manual Updates and Implementation. So here it is. I don't know if any of you attended our last year presentation, which talked about the updates that we were working on, and it's been about a year or so, and the manual is now completed and available on DOTA's website. So the agenda for today, we're gonna briefly discuss the goals of why we updated the manual, the highlights of the actual updates. We'll go into the different items, specifically only the highlights of what we changed majorly and how we improved upon the manual. And then we'll briefly touch on the implementation schedule. So going into goals, so there are several goals that DOT and we decided on initially on when we decided to update the manual. So a couple of the ideas were that we wanted to provide guidance to the designers for both like a clear guidance to the designers on Pbmp implementation, including LID. We wanted to revisit the actual criteria that was in the old manual. We want to establish a clear and consistent approach for Pbmp implementation. We wanted to develop documented processes to grant variances or waivers. And then we wanted to promote LID Pbmps while also considering the mission of DOTA in accordance with the FAA regulations that prohibit building of wildlife habitats. So we wanted to avoid Pbmps that would attract wildlife. And then we wanted to streamline the selection with all these criteria in mind so the designer can then select appropriate Pbmps based on their project. So then we want, the other goals include, we wanted to update the design criteria to ensure that it's consistent with the Honolulu Small MS4 permit as well as the county regulations. We definitely relied on the city and county of Honolulu for consistency's sake on deciding the regulations as well as the design criteria. We prepared sizing calculations, which also were provided to have consistency with the city and county regulations as well as the sizing guidelines, since all of the design happens in Honolulu and the designers are very familiar with the county regulations. And then we reevaluated the operations and maintenance considerations for the various Pbmps to ensure they're consistent with FAA restrictions, manufacturer recommendations, and then any lessons learned from previous Pbmp implementation. Last but not least, one of the big items that if you have attended the previous DOTA session was DOTA is updating their AMS, asset management system. It's a new one and it's called VOC, to include the Pbmp design review within the construction program, as well as a separate Pbmp inventory inspection and maintenance. And this will be done at DOTA airports statewide. So now we'll touch on the actual highlights of what was updated in the manual. So the first slide here is the outline of how the manual looks like. The manual is laid out to assist the project proponent in selecting and implementing Pbmps to reduce the impacts of stormwater on MS4, storm drainage system, and state waters. It has 6 chapters as it's laid out here. The introduction provides a general review of the background and regulatory requirements. Section 2, post-construction Pbmp applicability, provides an overview of which projects require Pbmps and how a project can qualify for a Pbmp variance. Section 3, post-construction Pbmp implementation, provides requirements on LID Pbmp requirements, infeasibility criteria, and how a project can qualify for an LID waiver. It also provides all the various types and the list of selection for Pbmps. Section 4, Pbmp design criteria, basically discusses pollutants of concern, acceptable Pbmps, sizing criteria, design process, DOT's design process, Pbmp O&M requirements, and then information that is needed to be submitted for a Pbmp design review. Section 5 goes into inspections, operations, and maintenance. This is essentially after the Pbmp is installed and how DOT maintains its AMS, which is VOC, to track the inventory, inspection, and maintenance of the installed Pbmps. Section 6 provides references and resources used to develop this manual. And then we have the appendices. The appendices are discussed on the next slide and basically provide the bulk of the design guidance. And the appendices are, in my opinion, a major update where the DOTA Pbmp manual now provides a comprehensive guidance on the design of Pbmps. So here are the 7 appendices that we have as a part of the manual. And these are integral part of the design since they provide the tools to evaluate, design, and implement Pbmps. They also provide the various options for you to look at: LID, source control, and treatment control Pbmps. I will go into the appendices into detail in the later slides. So this slide here highlights the design criteria appendices. So basically it talks about the appendices that highlight design procedures, O&M procedures, and then the appendices, these are the appendices that provide fact sheets. And again, we kind of looked at the city and counties model and the manuals all over the United States, and fact sheets for individual Pbmp design and or O&M seem to be the appropriate way to go, and that's what we did with the new manual. So if you look at Appendix 2, which is the LID Pbmp design fact sheets, and Appendix 4, the treatment control, they're laid out very similar in the sense that they both provide Pbmp category, the pollutants targeted, description, limitations, design guidelines, construction considerations, and example schematics. The design guidelines go into the detail of like, what are the general guidelines that you should consider when designing that specific Pbmp, what kind of pre-treatment is needed, the area requirements, minimum area requirements, minimum design criteria, and then the actual sizing calculations. And then the source control, which is Appendix 4, the design fact sheets, while they're very similar in the look, are like very slightly different by providing approach and suitable application. And they, instead of the design guidelines, they provide more of a design consideration for the source control methods, various options for new design versus retrofits. And then they also talk about O&M recommendations for the source control Pbmps. And then Appendix 7, which is the Pbmp O&M fact sheets, actually provide the inspection procedures, conditions that warrant maintenance, and then the maintenance procedures. While the Pbmp O&M fact sheets were actually developed to provide guidance for the inspection and maintenance, so that is essentially like the inspectors of Pbmps, the maintenance personnel, and the service contractors, these can also be used by the designers to develop their Pbmp O&M plans. And I'll touch on that later in the presentation as well. So going on to the next step, which is the asset management. So DOTA will use VOC for the construction design review process. And that also includes the Pbmp design review. So the VOC module, when set up for construction design review, as Brian mentioned, it is under final development. And when that is ready, you will also, the entire Pbmp review will also occur concurrently with the construction review. So the entire design process, including the Pbmp variance, on how AREE grants the variance, how you can request a LID Pbmp waiver and how AREE grants that waiver, how you're going to submit the documentation, and how you're going to address DOTA comments and receive acceptance. All of that is completely inside VOC, and then the designer will go through a set of web pages and questionnaires that will allow them to undergo this process. So one of the other highlights of the manual updates are the project requirements. While a lot didn't change, I want to touch on a couple of items. So one of the first things I want to touch on is the exempt projects. So while it was obvious that the exempt projects from the construction program would be technically exempt under the post-construction program, it was not explicitly stated. And so we revised the manual, and we also developed the VOC design process to make it completely obvious and evident that the projects that would be exempt from a construction design review process would automatically be exempted from the Pbmp review. For example, if you have a building interior renovation with no land disturbance, a project that is a building interior renovation with no land disturbance, then you wouldn't go through a construction design review process. So technically then, therefore, you're automatically exempted from the Pbmp review as well. Pbmp implementation. So we wanted to develop a clear and consistent approach. Once you determine that your project is not exempt, right? Then how do you implement the Pbmp? So we wanted to develop a clear and consistent approach for the implementation. So we wanted to make it very clear on which projects require Pbmps, specifically which small projects, and then how can you request a variance from Pbmp implementation based on FAA safety limitations. And so this whole process is now documented in DOTA's AMS VOC, and then you go through that process to request and get a variance from Pbmp implementation. So which projects require Pbmps? This hasn't really changed, but I just wanted to touch on it just in case somebody needs to know and they haven't worked on DOTA projects yet. So any project, Pbmps have to be considered for any project that meets the following conditions, right? Any project that has a construction activity that disturbs over an area of over an acre or more, and then smaller projects that have potential to discharge pollutants to DOTA MS4 drainage system or straight waters. So the criteria for the smaller projects are any project that has a steep earthen slope, a grade of more than 20%, equal to or more than 20%. If you're modifying, replacing, or installing new drainage structures, if the parking lots or buildings are adding 5,000 square feet or more of impervious area. The change here was earlier, it was 10,000, and we have reduced it to 5,000. And then the other change we made is we included all aircraft vehicle and equipment washing areas, and then all aircraft vehicle or equipment fueling areas, as well as container and material storage areas. So those are the changes. So now we'll talk about, okay, the requirements. So how do you actually request the variance, and what are the criteria for you to request one? So FAA limitations, FAA actually regulations define several on-airfield operation zones. And these are basically defined should an aircraft deviate from defined runway and taxiway surfaces. God forbid, we all don't want any aircraft failures or accidents, but there is a reason We all have to follow the regulations, and that's why FAA has those regulations. So there are specific on-field operational zones that you cannot put the Pbmps on. And then FAA also mandates, in addition to those, FAA also mandates protection zones for near airfield areas. These are areas where aircraft approach and departure. So the airspace and the spaces underneath. So for both these on airfield and near airfield areas, we looked at area zones that are related to Pbmp implementation. And then those are the runway safety area, or the RSA, the runway object-free area, or the ROFA, the taxiway safety area, taxiway object-free area, and taxiway safety area, the TOFA or the TSA, the aprons, and the aircraft operation area, or the AOA. Essentially, we looked at the airport layout plans for all these areas, how they were laid out, how they are specified. FAA specifies them, all of these areas in CAD maps, and we looked at all of those and developed the FAA exemption zones for Pbmp installation maps. These maps basically show you the zones where you cannot install Pbmps, and these maps are developed for all 15 DOT airports statewide. So this is a map, the FAA exemption map for Pbmp installation in Honolulu. These maps are available in the manual in Appendix 1, and then they are also available in VOC. We would actually encourage you to use VOC because it does provide you an interactive map where you can zoom in and look at your project site and determine whether or not it falls within the FAA exemption zone. This is a map, the same map, FAA exemption zone map for Lihue. And this is an FAA exemption map for Kahului Airport. As shown on the legend, I forgot to mention the red line is the actual FAA exemption zone for Pbmp installation, and the yellow is the airport property line. We're moving on to, okay, so then now you have your map. So how do you ask for a variance if you think that your project is inside one of those exemption zones? So you're going to utilize the documented process within the AMS. Until it's ready, I'm sure you can contact AirEE, but once VOC is set up, you'll go through a list of questions, and basically these are the 4 criteria that you would, or one of the 4 criteria that you would have to meet to be eligible for a Pbmp variance. So your project has to be located inside those FAA exemption zones that are provided in the Appendix 1 or the AMS. Your project returns the area to pre-development runoff conditions, or your project is solely to address water quality improvement or preservations. Examples can include shoreline protection, landscaping projects, Pbmp installation or retrofit projects, and then permanent erosion control. And then there is this catch-all other. The other is basically any project that kind of didn't fall in the water quality and preservation examples. If you have any other projects that do not really disturb land or something different that's going on, you should always approach AirEE, and they can review and let you know if your project is exempt from Pbmp implementation. So here is a screenshot of the VOC, which is under development right now. So as a designer, this is a screenshot of the designer going in, and these are the 4 questions you would answer. Based on your answers, it automatically will tell you whether or not your project qualifies for a Pbmp variance. So once you determine whether your project qualifies a Pbmp variance, say your project doesn't, then the next step you want to know is, okay, can I implement LID? And then for that, we developed LID infeasibility and waiver criteria in the new manual. So the reason for developing that was to establish, again, a clear and consistent approach for LID Pbmp implementation. We wanted to streamline the infiltration requirements, including physical restrictions, infiltration rates, depth to groundwater, et cetera, to see where you can actually implement infiltration Pbmps. Then we wanted to establish a process where you can request a waiver from LID Pbmp implementation. Again, same as the variance, you will go through the AMS to request a waiver. The criteria for the waiver are now on this slide. So basically the manual discusses how to determine the infiltration rates, right? You're going to determine your infiltration rates, make sure that your subsurface soil is able to infiltrate. DOTA, similar to the city and county of Honolulu, came up with a 0.5 inch per hour infiltration rate for feasibility for infiltration. And so we went on to the biofiltration, harvesting, reuse, and other infeasibility criteria and came up with specific questions that you can go through in section 3.4 or the appendix 3 of the appendix 3 or the AMS. So the appendix 3 is basically the LID waiver and infeasibility screening worksheet. So if you go through the list of questions that are in there, you can determine whether your project qualifies for infeasibility and therefore can request a waiver. So here's the appendix 3, first page of the screening worksheet. And here's the corresponding VOC screenshot. So essentially, as a designer, you would go into this tab, go through the questions list for each one of those criteria, which is the 4, the infiltration infeasibility, the biofiltration infeasibility, harvesting, reuse, infeasibility, and others. Again, as Brian and Jenna mentioned in their presentation, this is work in progress. So some of the titles and things that we are going to update, and they might look slightly different. So now that you've determined whether or not you can implement LID, then the next step is the actual implementation. So for the implementation, nothing really changed. DOTA's preference is LID first, followed by source control, and then followed by treatment control. So definitely we did not change up anything there. But we did clarify, we added this table to the Pvmp manual, which basically clarifies that LID Pbmps are required for all non-exempt projects that do not qualify for a Pbmp variance. And source control is required for all non-exempt projects. So regardless whether or not you are getting a Pbmp variance, you still are required to look at source control and see if there is something you can do to minimize the pollutants from coming into contact with the stormwater. And treatment control is required for all non-exempt projects that do not qualify for a Pbmp variance and if LID is infeasible. So if you got the waiver, then you would go down the list into treatment control. Then we also added a figure 3.2 in the post-construction Pbmp manual, which details the Pbmp requirement process. Basically, this is a flow chart that details the requirements, kind of takes you through your project steps. And this is essentially replicated in VOC in terms of like, steps and questionnaires. So you can review this flow chart, but also you can go through the VOC process as well. And then the next thing that we wanted to do was standardize the list of the LID Pbmps, or provide a list of standardized LID Pbmps. And so here's the list, and there is 11 LID Pbmp options to choose from. So if you are a project proponent and you have gone through the process, you are not qualified for variance and waiver, then this is the first step. You are going to look at these 11 options and come up with an option that kind of works with your site space constraints, as well as other site criteria that you may have. So DOT developed comprehensive design fact sheets for each one of these that I was talking earlier in the appendices. So Appendix 2 is basically the LID Pbmp design fact sheets. And then this is what an example looks like of a bioswale design fact sheet. And it I just provided the first 2 pages, but it talks about, your Pbmp category, your Pbmp category, your pollutants targeted, the description, your limitations of where you cannot, the area requirements, minimum design, and the sizing guidelines. On a similar note, DOT also wanted to prepare a list of standardized source control Pbmps, and this is the list that we came up with. We have 8 source control Pbmp options to choose from. So they are dispersion, therefore for dispersion of the stormwater runoff, fueling area design, loading area design, maintenance area design, material storage area design, triturator facility design, washing area design, and waste management area design. So these are very specific to the type of project that you have. So if your project does not do any of these, it wouldn't apply, but if it does, then it would. So just, you would have to look at them based on your project scope of work. And again, similar to the LID, we have an appendix of source control Pbmp design fact sheets. And here is an example of the washing area design. It's laid out very similarly, except that now we have approach, suitable applications, and then design considerations. The design considerations definitely go kind of talk about general new installations and retrofits. And the reason we did that is some of these source control BMPs are mostly, because the airports are so developed, it's mostly retrofits and redesign. So we wanted to give the option in the event the designer has to go with the retrofit or a new installation. We provided both options. And last but not least, we also prepared a list of standardized treatment control BMPs. Again, we have 8 of them, 8 options to choose from. Once the designer determines that they can't do LID, then these are the 8 options that they can select from to provide treatment control instead of LID. And similar to the others, there are comprehensive fact sheets, treatment control Pvmp design fact sheets, same information as the LID fact sheets. This is the actual major update that, in my mind, that we consider we've done, and this took us the bulk of work. And this, we believe, provides a comprehensive guidance to the designers and helps them look through the options, evaluate their site conditions, and pick the right BMPs. Now that we have our options, we have our criteria, we have our options, okay, then we are going to go in, okay, how are we going to actually design this? How are we going to size this? How are we going to go through the entire process? So here's the DOTA's design criteria. It's 5 steps. You're going to identify pollutants of concern. Then you're going to figure out your acceptable Pbmps. You're going to do the preliminary design. You're going to do the sizing, selection and sizing, and then your final design, as well as your O&M plan. We'll discuss all these steps in the next few slides. So the first one is the pollutants of concern. So how are you going to identify your pollutants of concern? So you, as a project proponent, can identify the anticipated pollutants of concern based on planned activities, whatever the site design you're planning on, the existing or proposed land use, legacy pollutants that may be potentially present on site, changes in stormwater discharge flow rates, velocities, durations, and volumes, sensitivity of the receiving waters to changes in stormwater flow rates, velocities, durations, and volume. And then last but not least, receiving water quality, which is basically looking at the 303D list of impairments to see if you need to target them for your pollutants of concern. As I mentioned, there is a process, again, for this in VSC. It's called a final step, just before you submit the design documentation. And it is the Pbmp checklist is shown here, and you basically go through the questions. I don't know if you can see it well, but it goes into the pollutants of concern that are based on your project activities and your land use, and then the pollutants of concern based on your 303D list, based on your discharge, or which water you're discharging to, and which airport you're working at, and which water you're discharging to. So now we're on second step, which is acceptable Pbmps. So based on your pollutants of concern, your site restrictions, your Pbmp pollutant removal or performance, and then some other requirements such as like the MS4 permits, TMDLs, or any other sensitive water body requirements that may pop up, the project proponent can identify acceptable Pbmps using table 4.1. And here is table 4.1. It basically summarizes the Pbmp categories, the different pollutants of concern on the top, and then the actual pollutant performance removal for the LID and treatment control Pbmps. Next, we are moving on to preliminary design. This is the step where you basically will come up with your preliminary site layout and consider all the site characteristics and constraints for your design. So we subdivided this into 4 little sub steps or whatever you want to call it, the site. So the first thing that we're going to do is a site assessment. Your site assessment should include an inventory and analysis of your natural as well as your developed conditions that would affect the Pbmp design. So information collected at this point would be your topography, your hydrologic patterns, your soils information, your geotech assessments, your existing vegetation, and if there's any environmental sensitive features, your site access, land use controls, utilities, things like that. And then the second step is identify stormwater standards. So project proponents should review stormwater standards, including DOT engineering standards, any applicable state and federal standards. Obviously this manual, right, since we prepared it. But additionally, you have to look at other things like soil subsurface hydrology evaluations, any engineering design requirements, FAA regulations, design standards related to FAA regulations. And then you move on to your preliminary site layout. In this step, you're basically going to develop a preliminary site layout. It can be an iterative process. You start with something, and then you will figure out, based on your site constraints and requirements, which Pbmps will actually match with your project site based on all the above, based on the first step, all the information that we collected in the first step and the second step. And then the goal, then we move on to the next step, which is a pre-design meeting. The goal of the pre-design meeting to be a step in a preliminary design is we wanted an effective communication so the designers and the TA can communicate effectively to consider any issues that come up early on. That way we're trying to consider BMPs that are in the best interest of DOT over time. So at this, the project proponents are strongly encouraged to request a pre-design meeting with AirEE so they can discuss their preliminary Pbmp design. They can actually review the O&M required for long-term effectiveness, accessibility, and other options. And this is a good opportunity to propose any innovative Pbmp design solutions if they have any. And also necessarily, you don't really have to stick to all the options that are provided in the manual. If there is a new innovative Pbmp product that is out there, you can always propose that at the pre-design meeting. The next step is now that you have your preliminary design down, you're going to move on to your selection and sizing. And this is kind of critical because your preliminary sizing, you know, whether you can meet your goals with a single BMP or if you want several BMPs needed to be applied in kind of a treatment train approach. So this is where the bulk of the sizing and the selection is portion would be. So DOTA did not change the criteria. It's same as before for both volume-based and flow-based designs. For volume-based, you're still required to capture the 1-inch rainfall. And for the flow-based, the Pbmp still have to pass the 0.4 inch per hour rainfall. So that did not change. The sizing calculations for individual Pbmps are provided in the Pbmp design fact sheets. And you can also request AirEE for an Excel that we created to kind of mimic that same process. And then obviously this is an iterative process again. So you will go back and forth between your calculations and selection to see and your space available and site constraints to see what works with your site or which Pbmps will work with your site. The final step is the final Pbmp design and the O&M plan. For coordination with ARE is recommended prior to just doing the final design to verify that the preliminary site layout is accepted. The Pbmp selection sizing is all, addressed, the DOTA comments from the meetings, and then at this point, DOTA will also request an O&M plan for each proposed Pbmp. So evaluating the required O&M at this stage will assist ARE with the planning and the inspection and maintenance of Pbmps. So it is critical for them for maintaining those Pbmps. So please bear that in mind, that is a required submittal. So in the final PB, this slide basically shows what are the required submittals and what do you need to provide for the Pbmps. So during the design phase, submit your project should have drawings, specifications, sizing calculations, O&M plan, and O&M costs. And then during the construction phase, if you're changing the design of the Pbmps for whatever reason, you need to submit the project package for ARE review. If not, you're going to provide the shop drawings, and you'll address any comments, finalize the same package. And then in addition, you're going to provide GPS coordinates, O&M date, warranty information, and Pbmp turnover date. Please note that the GPS coordinates are only required for certain projects right now because of the contractual language, but DOTA is working on changing that language in the future to include that all future DOTA projects will have them. Also note that the tenant improvement projects, if the tenants are making them, will not have that information. So for the projects where DOTA is unable to get the GPS coordinates for the Pbmps, they will use the consulting contracts, use us or Hart Krauser to go get the coordinates. Again, for this entire process, the VOC is an integral part. So all of this design package submission, as well as review and the comments back and forth, will all occur within the DOTA AMS, also known as VOC. So the Pbmp O&M plan is a required item, which is also, I don't think it changed from the old manual, but maybe it was not as evident or clearly mentioned, so that all project documents shall include Pbmp O&M plan. And you can refer to Appendix 7, which does have the Pbmp O&M fact sheet to use as a submission for your project. You can use that as your O&M plan or use that as a base to consider the Pbmp inspection and maintenance considerations for your project submission. Again, the design review is being done, and then in addition, DOTA will also be using VOC to maintain the Pbmp inventory, inspection, and maintenance tracking. And that module is also under final development. Actually, it is under development. I don't know if I can call it final, but the design review step is pretty much done. So here are the O&M fact sheets. So please note that the DOTA developed O&M fact sheets only for LID and treatment control Pbmps. The source control Pbmps will be evaluated on a case-by-case to determine whether they'll be considered a Pbmp in terms of, long-term inventory inspection and maintenance. So for example, if it's a velocity dissipator in the structural component, we might want to inspect, maintain, and put it in a service contract. Whereas if it's just a cover for, say, a fueling area or a maintenance area, like a building or a cover, then that may not be something that we would track under the Pbmp portion of the program. So therefore the O&M considerations, and that's one of the reasons why the source control fact sheets also have O&M considerations. And then the O&M fact sheets do not include the source control. So if you are going to use a new Pbmp that is not in the O&M fact sheets, then you would definitely have to come up with O&M plan for that Pbmp and submit it to DOTA for review. Here's what VOC will have. This is basically once a Pbmp is installed and it needs maintenance, this is a sample of our current maintenance and that we have the pre and post photos, and eventually we're gonna track all of this in VOC as well. So right now we started the process and we do have an inspection and maintenance log in there, and we are setting it up as we speak. So it's not final, but we are trying to get there. So last but not least, the last topic is the implementation schedule. So the manual, as I mentioned, is completed. We are currently working on the Honolulu Swamp revisions, which are anticipated to be completed by December 2021. And then VOC implementation, the construction design review, as Brian and Jenna mentioned, and Stacy mentioned, are under final development. We are anticipating, I think we did the final testing and there are some kinks. So we are hoping to have that module completed by the end of 2021, if not early 2022. ARE will send out a section-wide email that VOC set up, and the designers and contractors will be required to use this system moving forward. So please wait for that email, look for it when it comes. It might be the end of this year or early next year. And like Brian and Jana mentioned, please be patient because the system might have kinks. As with all new systems, it's a new system. So as we are testing, we're finding things. As you use it, I'm sure you will find things that arise during the process. So DOTA is available. DOTA has VOC personnel available to fix any issues. We have our personnel, like our staff, ETC staff. ARE is always available if you guys have any questions. So please feel free to contact them when that time comes with any questions. If you're facing any issues, you don't have to struggle alone. You can just let us know and then we'll try to help you out. And here are the resources. The post-construction Pbmp manual is now available at this website. We highly encourage you, if you haven't gone to our website, to go look at it and look at the Pbmp, new revised Pbmp manual. You can review it if you want to and familiarize yourself with it prior to being rolled out in early 2022. And then of course, we'll also let you know about the AMS VOC. And that's it. That's the wrap. Well, any questions?
Vijaya, thank you so much for that. We've got just like about a minute left. I've been answering questions as they came up, just a few questions that I could answer. Nothing left here, but I do want to mention something that Stacy Pickett had mentioned, and she wanted to kind of reiterate that ARE still has the ability in certain circumstances to require a Pbmp that would fall into the exempted areas. That's on a case-by-case basis, so it's something that they would work closely with you on if that did occur. So I just wanted to make you aware of that because there are some other considerations such as oil water separators, CDS units, and HDS units that would not have that wildlife attractant issue. So it is on a case-by-case basis. So just don't think that, just because I fall within this area that there is no option. But again, that is on a case-by-case basis. So I just wanted to mention that.
Right.
And
yeah, to add on to that, so every project, even if you're requesting a variance, you are required to submit that, and along with your submission, DOT will probably want to look at a scope of work, some sort of plan if you have one, and or a specification, so they can make that determination early on. So if you want to get your design approved quicker, yeah, it's in your best interest to submit as much information as you can early, so then DOTA can assist you with making that determination and getting you that.
Well, thank you everyone again. The next session begins at 2 o'clock. Please return to the sessions tab to see the next breakout sessions. Don't forget to stop by the networking lounge to talk to the other attendees and check out the leadership board to see where you're at right now. There's a lot of time to earn points. Thank you again for attending this session. And Vijaya, thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, everybody.